It's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for the morning. He is a doctor and a professor and a president. He is an author of countless books. He is the maker of thousands of disciples. And he is, as we heard yesterday, the bringer of the Word of God to God's people. Let us introduce and welcome Dr. Marvin McMickle to the stage.
Once again, good morning to everyone. Delighted to be with you again. My thanks to the bishop for this invitation to be a part of this annual conference. I come from the area wherein resides the Upper New York Conference of the United Methodist Church. There are some persons from that conference who are here. They will bring you more official greetings from that conference and that bishop, but I catch the aroma of the Upper New York Conference as they go about their holy work. And so I'm happy to be with you as an extension of the ministry of upstate New York. My thanks as well to all of the persons who have helped to shepherd me around this hotel complex. Make one wrong turn and you are lost for a week. And you need help to find your way. So I'm grateful for all of the assistance that has been provided. And thanks to all of you for coming back again for part 2 of our discussion about poverty and economic justice. If we could start on slide 1 for our technician in the back. I just want to do a quick recap of the text, the primary text that we were using on yesterday, and the primary challenge that I have come to set before all of you, both collectively as conference, but even more importantly because you'll be leaving this place as a collective and going to your individual places of service. I want to challenge you individually as clergy, as lay leaders, as congregations, to think about the issue of poverty and prosperity in such close proximity that one could travel less than a mile from your church location and could run into living conditions, levels of income, realities of concentrated poverty, extreme poverty, that are in some instances like third world countries. This hotel is a clear example of that. If you walk around the downtown area, you get one perception of Baltimore. You get the harbor perception. You get the yachts. I look out my window in the hotel out onto the harbor. I see yachts and boats lined up, manifestations of prosperity and wealth and comfort and excess. Go a mile from here. Go less than a mile from here. And what you will see is Luke 16. You will see a rich man dressed in purple and fine linen who eats sumptuously every day. That's one reality. The text then says, and at his gate, just outside the perimeters of his residential setting, they lay a beggar named Lazarus, covered in sores, who would have eaten the crumbs that fell from the rich man's table. And the dog, whose name was Moreover the dog, came and licked his sores, and they live in proximity. This is the challenge that I want you to see. It is not the individual issues of poverty versus the individual issues of prosperity. It is their proximity to one another. And it is the capacity of persons who live within a certain sphere of prosperity to ignore, overlook, pass by, not feel accountable to or for the poverty that impacts people who are within walking distance of where they traffic every day. And that, as Luke 16 tells the story, whether or not we end up in hell depends in large measure on the degree to which we have engaged on the issue of the poverty that impacts us. I'm going to make the point several times today that God's eternal judgment is much less defined by our careful observance of rituals. God is not keeping track of how well we go through the procedures and processes of our worship life or our congregational polity. That is not what God is looking for. What God is looking for in Luke 16 is the degree to which we have paid attention, have responded to. Hear this phrase again. The poor man would have eaten the crumbs that fell from the rich man's table, the implication being even the crumbs were not offered. And then this quote from Martin Luther King Jr., this was part of his 1963 I Have a Dream speech, in which he said that African Americans live on an island of poverty in the midst of a great sea of material prosperity. I want to flip that over and say that many churches in most urban areas are an island of prosperity that is surrounded by a great sea of poverty. And that what we have to do is find a way to engage with what is going on just outside our door. Now, I want to go to slide 8, if you can help me to get to slide 8, because I want to talk about the ways in which poverty and economic deprivation have been used historically as tools of prolonged oppression. And I want to give you two things to think about. One, I want to introduce you to a book by a man named Alden Morris, A-L-D-O-N, Morris, M-O-R-R-I-S. His name is up there. The book is entitled The Origins of the Civil Rights Movement. The Origins of the Civil Rights Movement. And in that book, he introduces a concept that he calls the tripartite forms of oppression. Tripartite. Keep that phrase in mind, because when we get down to the next line, which is womanist theology, we come again to the assumption of a tripartite problem, a three-pronged problem. Now, here is how Alden Morris talks about the way in which historically oppression based upon race was both practiced and prolonged. He said there were three forms of oppression that were used against largely African Americans by those who tried to keep them in check. The first of which, he says, was poverty. If you can keep people poor enough by denying them access to and the opportunities for higher paying jobs, if you can keep them in low wage, low skill, heavy labor industries, particularly during the days of slavery and then sharecropping, and even into the early industrial stages of American history, if you can keep them busy working 3 jobs with no benefits so that all they can think about is survival, you pretty much have that population in check. So the first thing you want to do, says Alden Morris, is keep people in poverty. Do not give them any belief, any hope, any assumption that they can break out. If it looks as if they're about to break out, then use the second piece of this tripartite system, which for Alden Morris is political powerlessness. If you can keep them poor and can keep them from voting, because if they could vote, they might vote for policies, practices, and persons that might suggest how their circumstances could be changed. So the first step is keep them hopelessly poor. The second step is keep them completely away from the franchise, from the right to vote. Make voter suppression, voter intimidation, one of the guiding principles of prolonged oppression. Someone caught me yesterday down in the lobby because I think when I was here for the bishop for the previous event, a much smaller event, I told a story about my uncle, whose name was Edward Donahue. How do we African Americans get these names? McMickle and Donahue. It just doesn't sound like anything from Africa to me. Somebody has been interfering in the bloodline. But nevertheless, in 1930, at the age of 60, Edward Donahue went to register to vote for the first time in the county that houses Louisville, Kentucky. This is 1930. My family tree essentially runs into and through Kentucky. When he got to the registrar's table alone, and I will not use the word, I will just use the letter, the registrar said to him in 1930, "Inns," you can fill in the gap, "do not vote in Kentucky." He said, "Well, I've come to change that." Now, don't ask me where a man by himself found the courage in Kentucky in 1930 to say to a white registrar of voters that he was going to change a centuries-long practice of denying the right to vote to certain people. But he said, "I've come to change that." Now, this is recorded in the Chicago Defender, which in those days was sort of the national newspaper for African Americans. So it was the November 7th, 1930 edition of the Defender that reported that this encounter had taken place. The second time Donahue spoke, he said, "I want to register to vote." And the registrar then said, "Inns will not vote in Kentucky." And Donahue, according to the newspaper, said, "Well, that's about to change." At which point the registrar pulled out a gun and shot him dead right at the registrar's table. This is all in the newspaper. I have a copy of my great uncle's death certificate. On the death certificate, it clearly says homicide. But the registrar pleaded self-defense. What was he defending himself against? Edward Donahue had no gun. What he had was an aspiration to break out of his circumstances, and that registrar saw his aspiration as a threat to his status quo. So he was arrested, the registrar, and he was taken and he pleaded not guilty, and he was released, and he went right back to his registrar's desk to tell other folks in subsequent election cycles that inns cannot vote, will not vote, do not vote in Kentucky. Now note this date, November the 7th, 1930. What that registrar was afraid of is what might happen if more and more and more Edward Donahues were to get the right to vote and collectively begin to exercise it. And it was November the 7th, 2008, when Barack Obama was elected president of the United States. And what that registrar was concerned about was that possibility that someone could come up from a place where historically there was a tripartite system of oppression and suppression and find a way to political power, who then might in turn around and empower those who supported him. So the second one was political powerlessness. The third one, if the first two don't work, if we can't keep you poor enough to keep you from dreaming, if we cannot keep you away from the vote to keep you from altering your circumstances, then use terror. Then just use flat out terror. Just burn a cross in your front yard. Just lynch your son or your daughter while you have to watch. I invite those of you who are unaware of American history to spend some time studying the history of lynching in the United States of America. Very few African Americans flipped out on 9/11/2001. We were, of course, tragically saddened by the circumstances and grieving the death of thousands of innocent Americans, but it was not the first time that African Americans had been exposed to terror. Terror for African Americans was not something that we'd never seen before. Edward Donahues was the victim of terrorism. 3,000 known lynchings were facts of terrorism. The Ku Klux Klan, the White Citizens Council, all of these were manifestations of terrorism by Americans, on Americans, in the United States of America. This is how oppression is prolonged. Poverty, political powerlessness, and sheer brute terror. Just terrorize people. Take this man down in Texas, chain his body to the back of a pickup truck, and drag him through the streets of Texas until his head is detached from his body. Hang nooses anywhere that you want to. The impulse for terror has not left this country yet. So poverty, political powerlessness, and the use of terror scare folks to death. That's how you maintain an oppressive culture. Now we come down to the next line, if we could go back to slide 8, because there's another tripart system. And it is captured in the term, the womanist theology formula. It's important to notice that the Me Too movement provides us a prism through which to think about theology. In the 1960s, James Cone introduced black theology, which dealt with the issues of can you be both black and Christian? Then people in Latin America, like Gustavo Gutierrez from yesterday, said, me too. We've got another kind of oppression that is rooted in economics and poverty. And then female theologians, largely white, said, me too. And feminist theology was introduced based upon the notion that there are gender restrictions in the life of the church. There are only so many places that women can go when they are aspiring for careers in the ministry. Now, I must pause to thank the Methodist Church for being the joyful recipient of so many African American women who were Baptists. They used to be with me. And I'll see them somewhere. I say, well, I don't see you around much. Where are you? He said, I'm a Methodist. I said, when did you fall in love with John Wesley? When I couldn't get a church in the Baptist tradition. That's when I left. So that feminist theology was a critique on the white church largely for its failure, its slow pace of embracing women in the ministry. And unless I miss my guess, even the Methodist Church is not heaven so far as getting appointments and promotions and voice in the life of the church. So feminist theology came next. But then the womanist movement said, me too. And this is womanist theology. It is a tripartite formula, 3 prongs. Think about people in this country who suffer from racism and gender discrimination and poverty or class distinction. People who suffer all 3 of these. I struggle with poverty, I struggle with gender, I struggle with race, and I have to find a way to find some hope in the church. If we are not addressing all 3 of those things, we are not really about the business of the work of God. So poverty, for both civil rights issues and womanist issues, and gender and class and race are the formulas that have held folks back for so long. I want to go to slide 9, if you will, and go to the book of Amos. There are 5 verses in Amos that we ought to pay attention to. All of these are the prophet's critique of the ruling class of ancient Israel. All of these are the prophet's critique of the ruling class of ancient Israel. 1, Amos 2, verse 6. You sold the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. Your regard for people was so insignificant, you would exchange them for material benefits. Well, listen, this country was based upon people being sold for the economic advantage of somebody else. So the notion that the rich sort of traffic in the manipulation of the lives of the poor is nothing new. Let's go back, if we could, and stay there. Amos 4, verse 1. You oppress the poor and you crush the needy. This is the prophet's critique of the ruling class. Amos 6, 4 and 6. Here is the side-by-side contrast. You lie on beds of ivory. Now listen, you can have a bed with a wooden base. You can have a bed that's got 2 or 3 mattresses. But when the base of your bed is made of ivory, what you're saying is, I got money to burn. I can make my bed, it sounds like somebody's golden toilet. Okay, never mind that. You lie on beds of ivory, but you do not grieve over the ruin of Joseph. I said yesterday, one of the signs of a Christian's heart is that you have a conscious compassion for the circumstances of the poor, or better yet, you obviously care about the circumstances of those who are so much worse off than you. And then Amos 8, 4 and 5, you bring ruin to the poor of the land and practice deceit with false balances. This is economic manipulation. It's not a level playing field. So all of these instances are the prophet condemning the ruling class at the expense of the poor in the time frame that ancient Israel would have considered to be their golden age. In the 8th century BC, in both the northern and the southern kingdom, when Israel was rich and powerful and prosperous, all subsequent generations of people of Israel wanted to get back to that golden era. If we could just get back to when we could lie on our beds of ivory and not be concerned about what's happening to the poor, they wanted to make Israel great again. If we could just make Israel great again. Now, in this case, again is pretty clear. Again is we want to get back to this clear, obvious, sustained, intentional gap between the richest of us and the poorest of us, without any consideration for how our prosperity is built on the backs of their poverty. Friends, may I just say to you, I want to make America great. I really do. I want America to become as great as it can be. My objection is not the first three words. My objection is the last one. Because I don't know when this again was. Make America great again. So let's do some history. When might that have been, and who was left out? The 18th century? You do know that this is 2019. The first African persons who came to this country as indentured servants came in the 17th century in chains. Let's make America great again. Is that the again? Or the 18th century, when we were trafficking across the Atlantic Ocean and maybe as many as 12 million people torn from Africa, 2 months across the ocean, sold on auction blocks, branded, whipped, sold, and worked to death. Let's make America great again? That's what you have in mind? Or the 19th century, and Donald Trump's favorite president, beyond himself, Andrew Jackson. In 1830, Andrew Jackson signed into law the Indian Removal Act, which required the forced removal of all Native Americans from the east side of the Mississippi River to the west side of the same river, so that settlers, white settlers, could take their land either for slavery or for cultivation. And along that movement, we had what was known as the Trail of Tears, where thousands upon thousands of Cherokee Indians died in that forced removal. Let's make America great again. Or the 20th century, before child labor laws and before women had the right to vote. When lynch mobs ruled the land, when is this mystical again? It is, I'll tell you what I think it is. It is when white advantage and white privilege and the restoration of a country that vaguely remembers what things used to be like. Let's go back to when we were simply in charge. My home in Chicago, not far from where I lived a young boy named Emmett Till. Not far from where I lived. Somebody once asked Trent Lott, who was a senator from Mississippi, when was America's golden age? Now catch the tense. This was in the 1980s. When was America's golden age? Trent Lott said America was never better than it was in Mississippi in 1955. If you want to find the golden age of America, go to the University of Mississippi in 1955, 6 years before James Meredith was allowed to integrate. 1955 just happens to be the year in which Emmett Till from Chicago went to visit his uncle in Money, Mississippi. Now, I'm from Chicago. They don't teach us in Chicago not to whistle at women. They just don't teach you that. You just do what you do. So he was unconditioned to the Southern customs that you have to show a certain reserve. I don't know if he whistled or not. I know they said that he did, and guilty of the crime of whistling, he was taken from his uncle's house in the middle of the night, and the next time anybody saw him, he had been shot in the head, beaten into a pulp, the motor of a cotton gin tied around his neck with a piece of barbed wire, and his body thrown into a muddy piece of territory. He was found several days later, so badly bloated that only a ring on his finger could be used to identify who he really was. And his mother wanted to have an open casket funeral so the world could see what happened to her son in Trent Lott's golden era. Let's make America great again. For who? At whose expense do we go back? So what Amos is saying is, God's frustration is, you want to go back to a time when you were primarily the ones who were privileged. Let's go to the next slide, please. Slide number 10. There are 4 things I want to suggest that we can do, that you can do, that I can do, to make America great again, or make America great. The first is we have to have a biblical vision for the future. Walter Brueggemann, a great Old Testament scholar, in his book Prophetic Consciousness, says there are 2 ways by which to view the world. One he calls royal consciousness, and one he calls prophetic consciousness, or a royal vision or a prophetic vision. Now, the royal vision or the royal consciousness, says Brueggemann, is always to reinforce the status quo for the sake of the ruling class. Never envision a future that is different than that which is being envisioned by those who are in charge. Because if you do, they are likely to turn on you in order to preserve their status quo. So, folks who are in charge tend to have, says Brueggemann, a royal consciousness. Let's keep the good times going for us. But, says Brueggemann, God's people ought to be free enough from the world to have a prophetic consciousness in which they are able to envision a future that does not necessarily begin and end with what is in the best interest of the ruling class. God wants God's people, that's you and me, to not be constrained by the notion that everything that is good is defined by those who are currently in power. Which consciousness do you have? Who defines your global vision? Is your worldview America first? Let me tell you this story. Barack Obama was not our first black president. I don't mean Bill Clinton either. He may have thought he was, but he was not. The first black president, and I know it must be true because I saw it in the movies, was Chris Rock. In the movie Head of State, Chris Rock is elected president of the United States. To make matters even more interesting, his vice president was Bernie Mac. Now, I would want to spend about 24 hours in the country governed by Chris Rock and Bernie Mac just to see what they might do for a day. That'd be about enough for me. It's about one day. In the movie, Chris Rock campaigns against a person who is an obvious clone of Dick Cheney. I mean, it's so conspicuous. And he ends every speech by saying, "God bless America and nobody else." Now, it's bad enough to say God bless America as if the only country God cares about is America, but to say God bless America and nobody else was a little much. So in the last campaign speech, debate, The Cheney clone goes first, and he gives his little talk, and he ends by saying, "God bless America," and nobody else. And President almost Chris Rock responds by saying, "How about this? How about God bless America and Cuba? Or God bless America and Jamaica? Or God bless America and all the nations of Africa? Or how about this? How about God bless America and everybody else?" Now, here is a theological as well as a political quandary. Where do you say the sovereignty of God extends? How far do God's interests reach? Because if all you ever say is "God bless America," then you are informed by the theology of Irving Berlin. God bless America. God, on the other hand, I think is informed by a different song from my ancestry. A song of slaves and sharecroppers and folks struggling to make sense of their lives, who found somehow the courage to say, not "God bless America," but "He's got you and me, Bishop, in his hands. He's got you and me, brother, in his hands. He got everybody here in his hands. The God we serve has the whole world in his hands. He is a global God who loves everything that God has made." I hope God does love America. We sometimes make it hard for him to do so, or her. But God does not love other nations less. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the world and they that dwell therein. You've got to have God's vision to think about the transformation that the prophets have in mind. You've got to have a vision that lifts everybody up and not just somebody's. Then you've got to have values by which you live every day. Let's go back to the slide if we could. Values that inform your behavior. Micah 6:8 is a values statement. After you worship, after you've prayed and praised, after you've taken off your clerical garb and you call benediction, this better kick in. This is what you do when you leave church. After we've had church and we're left to our own devices, how do we govern each day of our lives and each step of our journey? He has shown you, O human, what is good. What does the Lord require of you? 3 things. Values. Do mishpat. Justice. That means do everything that you know you are obligated to do. There are no brownie points for doing justice. There are no extra stars in your crown because you gave something to help the poor or the needy. You should have done that. Do justice. Having done what you should, now do some more. Love, chesed, tzedakah, righteousness, mercy. Love it. Do justice, do it. Love to do more voluntarily because God has put it in your heart to respond to human need with a sense of overflowing mercy and concern. How much is too much? Here's my guiding principle. I will not give other folks any more than God has given to me. But if God has been good to me and gracious to me and plentiful to me, why am I holding out? Love mercy. And then the third one, walk. Now, this word humbly is tricky because it doesn't mean humility in the sense of your head is down and you're walking 4 paces back. It means really walk obediently with your God. Do justice, love mercy, and wherever God is leading you, go where God is leading you in terms of caring for the needy who are in the world around us. These are the values by which Methodists and Baptists and Pentecostals and Presbyterians ought to live every day of their lives. We can fix what's wrong in this country if we have God's vision and God's values. And then number 3, if you can go back, our voices as advocates for the vision that we are trying to establish. In Ezekiel 3 and again in Ezekiel 33, we are introduced to the term watchman. Now, pardon the male language, I'll just say it, but know that that's 10th century language. Son of man, I have made you a watchman over the house of Israel. What is a watchman? Ancient Israel was an accumulation of walled cities. Some folk lived inside the walls. Most folks lived outside the walls. When danger came, the folk on the outside of the walls were to be given warning in sufficient time that they could then move inside the wall before an approaching invading army could get to them. How would they know to stop what they were doing and make their way inside the walled city? There was someone up in a watchtower paying attention to what was going on in the surrounding environment. They only had one job. Watch. It's not complicated. Watch. Look to the north, the south, the east, and west to see if you see anything coming that might endanger the people who are on the outside of this wall. And if you see it, say it. If you see it and you say it, and the people do not respond to what you have said, they will die because they did not pay attention to you, but you will have saved yourself because at least you said what you saw. But if you decide not to say it, you saw it, I pointed it out to you. Here is the danger, here are the problems, here is the pain, here is the suffering. You saw it, but for whatever reason, perhaps to preserve your sense of status quo-ness, you did not say anything about it. 2 things will happen. 1, they will die. But 2, their blood will be on your head because you did not serve your role as watcher. Every preacher in this room, hear me well. You are primarily a watcher of the status quo, of approaching dangers. Your job is not that complicated. You are not just a priest. You are not just a pastor. And I don't want to say just to minimize. I want to elevate another task. Are you paying attention to what is going on in this country, in this culture, in this world? And are you saying something about what you are seeing? Voices. Wonderful song by Simon and Garfunkel in my earlier days called The Sound of Silence. Things are happening in this country that are being met resoundingly with the sound of silence. I do not care if Mitch McConnell is silent. I'm not nearly as concerned about his silence as I am about the silence of pulpits in this country. It is not Mitch McConnell's job to have prophetic consciousness. He is hooked up in the royal consciousness connection. It is our job, those of us who took oaths, signed covenants, had hands laid on us, transferring from one generation to the next the obligation of being voices for the voiceless and advocates for those who have no one to speak on their behalf. And so say something, my brothers and sisters. And then number 4, we come back to voter suppression. There is a reason why there is such an aggressive form of voter suppression. It is a conscious attempt to maintain the status quo. But I want you to see these two words together and say them quickly. Justice, just us. Justice, just us. Justice, now slow it down. Justice, just us. Some folk only want justice that extends as far as just us. There can be no justice that is for any one group of just us. Liberty and justice for all except. Our job is to not just urge folks to vote, but to vote for policies, programs, people, things that help to alter the present dilemma, to get people in who understand the difference between justice and just us. If you got the new slide 11, I'd like to see it. Yeah, okay. Now, this is a question of inclusion. I'm going to stop on this slide. For whom does the world want justice? And who is being left out of inclusion? I heard your discussion yesterday. I say to you again, the Methodist Church is not alone in discussing the role of the LGBTQIA community. Every denomination in the country, my own included, is badly and deeply divided over this issue. But let's at least keep the Bible out of this. Because if you put the Bible in it, you're going to have more stuff against you than you do for you. If I hear one more preacher quote to me Leviticus 18:22, period. There are 26 chapters in Leviticus. You got one verse. But if you want Leviticus 18:22, you've got to take the rest of Leviticus with you. All preachers who have done classes in exegesis and hermeneutics know you cannot pick out your one favorite verse and ignore all the rest that's in the same book. I want to tell you what's in Leviticus. And I want to ask you if you are as prepared to enforce all of those things as you are verse 22. So in Leviticus 18, it says you have prohibitions about same-sex activity. Fine. In the same book, there are prohibitions against eating shellfish, against wearing clothing made of more than one garment, of women having to purify themselves 7 days after every menstrual cycle, and 7 days after childbirth, and then go to a priest to prove you have been through all of the ritual cleansings. When is the last time anybody in here Leviticus says anyone caught in adultery, man and woman, should be stoned. We don't stone adulterers. We put them in the White House. Leviticus says, do not cut the hair on the side of your head. You've seen the Jewish men with the curls coming down. I don't see any curls in here on the heads of them. My point is, we have weaponized one verse at the expense of an entire book of the Bible. You only have one option. Embrace the book of Leviticus and live by a 10th century BC holiness code with dietary restrictions, clothing restrictions, sexual restrictions, or move on. And conclude that we do not live as a culture in a secular democracy by a 10th century BC holiness code, which even Israel does not observe anymore, except for 10% of their population. Okay, I'm rushing on to Romans 1. Oh, I've got to have Romans 1. Justice or just us? So Romans 1, says God has given them over to certain sins, same-sex sins. Okay, it's there. But keep reading. And when you want to get mad at everything Paul was mad about. Paul says, and as well, God gave them over to greed, slander, boastfulness, gossip, envy. All of our churches are caught up in strife right now. Murder, arrogance, and disobeying parents. You cannot take Romans 1, 24 and 25 and call it a day. Be as mad about the rest of this as you are about that one thing, or move on. No selective exegesis. No one-verse theology. We tend, you and I, to pick the one thing that we do not do. And we demonize the one thing that we do not do and call that God's will. But all the other stuff that we do, did anybody find yourself on that remaining list up there? Are you mad about that? Will you ban from ministry in your church anybody who is boastful, greedy, arrogant, divisive, strifeful? If you're not going to ordain folk of a particular sexual practice, then don't ordain adulterers. But for God's sakes, do not go to Red Lobster wearing an outfit made of wool and silk and say how much God hates homosexuals. It just is not only duplicitous, it is almost sinful to zero in on some behaviors and ignore the ones that most efficiently involve you. So I want to give you one last verse, bishops. In Matthew 10, verses 3 and 4, we are introduced to the Lord's 12 disciples. The list is going along pretty good. I call these folks the Galilean Mafia. Peter, James, John, Andrew, all fishermen, same hometown, right around the Decapolis area, 10 cities around the Sea of Galilee. And then all of a sudden, they toss in these two names: Matthew the tax collector and Simon the zealot. Now you tell me two more unlikely people to be joined next to Jesus. A tax collector worked for the Romans to exploit his own people to support the occupying army. The zealots hated the Romans, but most of all, they hated the tax collectors. Jesus intentionally calls folks from two broad extremes. Let me get a tax collector, and let me get a zealot, and have them both follow me. And while Peter and Judas and James and John, over the course of those 3 years, show their true colors of being in it for reasons other than the Lord's purposes, you never hear a word of any conflict, of any tension, of anybody asking one or the other of them to leave the church. Matthew the tax collector and Simon the zealot serve the Lord together. To the Baltimore-Washington Conference of the United Methodist Church, some of you may be Matthew the tax collector, and some of you may be, at least theoretically, Simon the zealot. You occupy extremely different positions. Learn from your predecessors. The one thing you have in common is the Christ who called you to come and follow me. Do not break up. Get in line behind Jesus and let Jesus lead you all the way.